Section 23 of The Unlit Lamp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Unlit Lamp by Elisabeth Sanxay Holding. Book 3, Chapter 6, Discords. 1. Twice in one day, thought Al. It won't do. We can't go on like this. He was walking up and down that bedroom he so hated, with its silly little four-post bed and the thick carpet, and the offensive, dainty imitation masculinity of it, a woman's idea of a man's room. Two little blue-shaded electric lamps, a fool of a little table. He kicked at the table as he passed it, and Andre's photograph on it fell down. He was profoundly disturbed, not so much angry as dismayed. Trapped, no way of getting out. "Why, damn it all," he cried. "I can't be like this. It isn't me. It isn't what I want. This isn't what I meant. We are interfering every hour of the day with each other. It won't do." The first thing had been his fault, he admitted. He shouldn't have been so vehement or so hasty. But it had been the sort of thing hardest of all for him to endure with patience. He had gone into the kitchen, where he was not expected to go, because he had been hungry at a wrong time, and there he had seen a hideous thing. It might have looked to other people like a charwoman scrubbing the floor, but to him it was very much more than that. She didn't even look up. What concern of it was hers who came and went in this house? She was a wretched little old woman. He stood in the doorway, looking down at her, at the tiny knob of white hair on her bony skull, her narrow shoulders working stiffly, at her clumsy hands pushing the brush back and forth. She breathed hard from her puny effort. She tried to appear more vigorous when she heard someone enter, being well aware that for the charwomen of the world, effort is accounted of more worth than accomplishment. He stared and stared at her, crawling slowly on her hands and knees, working this work in the stupidest and cruelest way. On the kitchen table her lunch was set out for her on a newspaper by the superior visiting maid. No one would come near her or speak to her. She was shut up here to scrub alone. "Here, get up," he said abruptly. She looked round with bleared and watery eyes. "Get up," he said again. "But I ain't done," she protested. "Get up," he shouted. He could not tolerate for one instant longer the sight of this old creature at his feet. It was obscene. She clutched at the table and pulled herself to her feet. "I can do it if yer give me time," she said with quivering indignation. "If I take longer, I don't charge so much." Al knew everything in the world about her. She was the typical case. He knew where and how she lived, what she earned and how she spent it. He cross-examined her and she answered him mendaciously, but he was able to sift the truth from the lies. "Now, see here," he said, "you're 65 or so." She declared for working purposes that she was 50. "You've earned a rest. You've worked all your life." "I'm able," she began. "You're not. Now, see here, I want you to go home, now. I'll see that you get a living allowance from a certain source every week. It's not charity, d'you understand? Not charity. It's what you have a right to demand from society. You can consider me the agent of society." Her education was incomplete and she did not understand the meaning of his terms. "The society gave me coal last winter," she observed. "I didn't never—" He didn't trouble to explain that he represented nothing more than impartial justice. "Take this now and go home," he said, And for God's sake, don't go crawling round scrubbing up anyone else's floors, ever. Get drunk if you want." "Oh, I never. "It's better," he said, "better than this. It'll be your money, the allowance you'll get. Little enough, but you can waste it in any way you like. Try to live." From behind the kitchen door she took down a heartbreaking fuzzy black cape trimmed with jet, and the disreputable ghost of a hat. She tucked the money he gave her into a tremendous handbag and retied the clasps with string. She was not grateful any more than one is grateful for sunshine. In an inexplicable world, these benefits came sometimes upon the just and the unjust. She had had a neighbor, mother of 9 children, who had been miraculously sent off to the seaside for 2 weeks of rest out of 40 years of life. She knew of other things like that. She was only in a hurry to get away before further investigation revealed little weaknesses that might repel the agent of society. Al had gone to his wife about this, and she had been angry. "Who is going to finish the floor?" she demanded. "Jenny won't do that rough work." "I don't care if it's never finished. I won't have that sort of thing in my house. It's just what I'd give my life to put an end to. It's—" "I suppose you'd admire me if I did it?" "Yes, I should," he answered. "You're better able to do it than that poor old skeleton." "I don't care much about your admiration," said André slowly. "This is your house, is it? Not mine? That's just the way father talks. My house. I won't have this and that." "I didn't mean to be arbitrary," he said, quickly contrite. "Only, don't you see—" He went on to explain. André could, as usual, see his point of view, but she didn't agree. "She's a wretched, drunken old creature," she said. "But, damn it all, why shouldn't she be?" he cried. "What's that got to do with it? You know plenty of people who drink, but you don't suggest condemning them to servitude for life, do you?" "If you want to run the house, you can," she said. "You can settle this now. Jenny won't finish that floor, and I certainly won't." "Then I will," he said, and he did. André hated him for that. She was not too aloof to be unconcerned with what Jenny would think and say of that performance. They had lunch in absolute silence. And yet, little by little, they were weakening. They were neither of them quarrelsome or resentful, and they had a marked respect for each other's obstinacy. 1 hour more would probably have seen them reconciled and laughing, if Tomlinson and Bucks hadn't appeared. These comrades were more than André could endure. She had in the beginning made a frigid attempt to be polite on Al's account, but her politeness was neither desired nor understood. Tomlinson was a big, stout, brutal fellow with a jaw shaved blue. He didn't hesitate to express his opinion of Al's mode of living, and he did it profanely. "How the hell do you expect to have any influence?" he shouted. "You preach one thing and you practice another. You and your flat and your servants and your fine clothes." He was a professional socialist, a politician. He was honest enough in his aims, but quite otherwise in his methods. He had to consult Al frequently, because Al had a considerable personal following in various clubs and centrals, and was quicker and more intelligent than he. He admired Al. He told him frankly enough of his shadiest transactions, because Al, although tiresomely honorable, knew life and was not squeamish. He wanted him now to accept a nomination on their ticket, which Al refused. He had a great many reasons for refusing, and Tomlinson a great many for his accepting. It was a very loud and furious argument, although neither of them was really angry. Bucks didn't enter into it. He was a bald, scholarly little man with a full brown beard, a sort of secretary and mentor to Tomlinson. He rarely talked. He sat and smiled and watched, and was ready to give data at any moment. André would have rather liked him for his mildness and courtesy, if his collars had been cleaner. She was not constituted to rise above that. She shut herself into her room while they stayed this day. Every sound of that loud discussion reached her, and filled her with rage and disgust. And then, to cap it, "It's your wife!" shouted Tomlinson. "That's what it is! Your damn society lady with her fine airs! That's what's ruining you!" "You shut up and mind your own business," said Al, and no more than that. No other defense or praise of her. Perhaps she didn't realize how tired he was, or how secretly guilty Tomlinson's reproaches had made him, for after the comrades had gone, she took occasion to speak her mind, and she found him unusually irritable. They took a long stride forward in frankness that afternoon. She called him vulgar and coarse, and he said she was idle and selfish. All this Al remembered now, walking up and down the room. "It mustn't be this way," he thought. "It must not be. And I'm the one to change it. I'm older. I'm responsible. I knew there'd be difficulties. It's my job to explain and to reason and not to quarrel with her. There must be some common ground." "And even if there isn't," he went on, "even if we never think alike, it needn't matter. Good God, haven't I enough restraint and common decency to get along with the woman I love, even if she has different opinions? Let her be herself." He washed his flushed face in cold water and brushed his unruly hair. He subdued his spirit and went to look for André. He found her in the library, dressed for the street, drawing on her gloves. "Going out?" he said unnecessarily. She said "Yes," curtly, and then her heart melted. He looked so neat and subdued and good. "I'm going for a walk," she said. "Do you want to come?" They went out together into the bright winter air, but, try as they would, no words of reconciliation came from either of them. No words at all. Was it some subtle reflection of her own mood that made him feel so wretched? He was quite as tall as she, he was properly dressed, he carried himself well, he was strong, vigorous, not bad-looking. Why then should he feel so small and so, he had no other word for it, so cheap, as he walked beside her that day? Of course she was beautiful, but she always had been. Of course she was proud and a little disdainful, but that also was nothing new. She looked very lovely in her furs. He saw people turn to look at her. And suddenly, as plainly as if she had spoken the words, he knew that she was ashamed of him. He stopped short. "I forgot," he said. "There's something I must finish. I'll go back." She made no attempt to dissuade him. She let him go without a word, with a smile which he knew was one of relief. When he turned back, he saw her, still walking down the drive, a distinguished and beautiful creature. "Snob," he said to himself. "Vain, fickle, cold-hearted snob. She didn't want me with her. She doesn't give a damn where I go or what I do." A terrible grief assailed him, which he imagined was anger. "I might have known it," he told himself. "They're all alike, her sort. Pampered and flattered." He struggled desperately back to justice. "I'm making a mountain out of a molehill. She simply wanted to be alone. Nothing very bad in that. She's only a kid, after all. She cared enough for me to marry me. She does care for me." 2. If he had been able to measure the molehill, he might not have been so sure of exaggeration. André went on as if she could never walk enough, block after block, until the sun had gone, and twilight come, and lights began to glitter. She stopped in at the plaza for a cup of tea. "I'm ashamed of him. I'm ashamed of him," she said to herself. "I'd be ashamed to have him here with me. I only like him when we're alone. I can't bear for other people to see him. It's like a nasty secret. Amour. It degrades me. Oh, I ought to have had more pride than to throw myself away on a common little man like that. Oh, why didn't someone stop me?" 3. The next afternoon, at exactly the same hour, she was walking down Fifth Avenue with Malloy, and with him went again into the plaza for tea, no doubt to vindicate her pride. And if it was a test, it was successful, for she was not ashamed of him. End of section 23.
Section 24 of the Unlit Lamp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. The Unlit Lamp by Elisabeth Sanxay Holding. Section 24. Chapter 7. The Pastry-Cook's Daughter. Claudine mounted the front steps with an unusual languor. "I'm afraid I'm going to be ill," she thought. "This cold hangs on so. I must have some hot tea and lie down." To tell the truth, she would not really have been sorry to be ill. It would have been a respite from the nightmare life of the past weeks. Nothing but worry and distress about her son, nothing but disgraceful quarrels between him and his father, and an exasperation and irritability on the part of Gilbert, which terrified her. He blamed her for everything, for his disappointment in the boy, for the costly folly of the boy's existence. Claudine was neither able to quarrel nor to keep silent. She felt obliged to defend Bertie, to make excuses for him. She even told lies for him and paid his debts herself when she was able. Gilbert frequently found this out and said that she deceived him treacherously, which was true. She was not at all contrite. She knew that with Bertie, threats and bluster were of no use whatever. One had either to convince him by reasoning, which she was incapable of, or to win him through his affection, which was what she tried to do. She knew that he loved her, perhaps more than anyone else had ever loved her. "How can you bear to make me so unhappy, Bertie?" she had asked him. "It isn't me that makes you unhappy, Mammy," he had answered. "It's Father. You wouldn't worry about me if he didn't make you. You know I'm all right, a heart of gold under a rough exterior, a harmless buffoon. I'm just consciously being wild, as is proper for my years. It's all Father's fault." She acknowledged to herself with some surprise that he was right. Left to herself, she would not have worried over Bertie. There was a quality in even his most grave follies, a grace, an innate delicacy, which in her eyes quite redeemed them. He didn't love his vices. He played with them. She rang the bell and the door was opened instantly, not by the maid, but by Bertie himself. "Hello, Mammy," he cried. "I've been waiting for you. Your tea's ready." She followed him into the front room and found it charmingly prepared for her. He had lighted the gas logs and had drawn up before the blaze a little gilt table, never before used for such a purpose, on which he had arranged a silver tea service, always kept in state on the dining-room sideboard, and a bowl of red carnations. "Why, Bertie," she cried, "how dear of you!" "Wasn't it? Sit down, Mammy, and try a cake." "My dear boy, did you buy the flowers and cakes for me yourself?" "I bought the flowers. The cakes were a gage of love. Mammy, looking about you, don't you feel convinced that I be the best husband that ever was?" "I dare say," she answered, smiling. Mammy, don't you smell a rat? What do you mean? Why these preparations? Why this introduction of the topic of husbands? Do explain, what new nonsense is this? I'll tell you, Mammy, I'm going to be married. Bertie! She frowned with displeasure. True. I don't like to hear you say such things, even in a joke. A boy of 18. Oh, it wouldn't be for 5 years, Mammy. You mustn't think of binding yourself to anything of that sort at your age. Surely you're sensible enough to know that you're sure to change. I never do, but don't you see what a good idea it is, how it will keep me safe in the midst of all sorts of temptations which beset a handsome youth? I suppose I am a youth, aren't I, although no one ever called me one. It's not right to expect any girl to wait 5 years for you, and what makes you think you'll be able to marry in 5 years, you silly boy? You've never earned a penny. I'll explain all that presently. Mammy, seriously, I've arranged my future in a very remarkable way. And who on earth do you imagine will marry you after waiting 5 years? She is beautiful, good and rich, said Bertie. She's the daughter of the king of the Pastry-Cooks. Who? Her name is Giulia Santigiorni. But who is she? An Italian? Yes, her father's Santi, the caterer. Oh, Bertie, I only ask you to see her. She's altogether lovely, and she's had one of those marvellous nouveau riche educations. You know the sort of thing, lessons in everything from the most expensive teachers. Sings, plays, paints, speaks all known languages, studied deportment and household management, and first aid. She's been for the last 2 years in a convent in Paris, and they've made one of those regular foreign young girls out of her. You know, modest and gentle, always on the alert to be respectful and polite to old people. The king of the Pastry-Cooks is rather keen on society. He gives monster parties. You never saw anything like them. They're awfully pathetic. He gets paid entertainers, singers and dancers, and, oh Lord, wizards. He loves wizards. We sit in rows in the ballroom while the wizard holds a show on the stage he's had put up. Then he serves a supper. Oh, never in your life have you dreamed of such suppers. And when you're going home, you each get a present. Not a favour, Mammy, but a genuine present. Silver cigarette case and so on. Of course he doesn't know half the people who come. He prowls around, a poor fat gloomy devil, and no one bothers with him. But he sees a crowd in his house, and that satisfies him. Where is the mother? Dead long ago. He has 2 daughters and 2 sons. They're all very nice and respectful. But do you think it's quite a suitable match? Couldn't be more so. My Giulia is the most well-bred thing that ever drew breath. You'd feel quite ashamed before her. I believe she took lessons in how to behave in all European courts and how to entertain royalty. But, my dear boy, how do you propose to live? On the pastry-cook father? No, I'll get on, Mammy. I always do. I'll either go to Princeton next autumn or go into father's business, whichever you advise. No, Bertie, you're the one to decide. What do you want to do? What do you want to make of your life? Whatever I can, he said. I don't really care very much. I want to make a good show, that's all. Earn a living. Bertie, dear boy, with your intelligence, you ought to aim higher than making a living. Isn't there something you can put your heart into? Some sort of work you could really... Not any more, Mammy. It's this ice cap. What do you mean? You ought to know. Old Lance talks enough about it. It's going to cover the earth. A new glacial period, going to destroy life on this planet. He rose and began walking about the room, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. I've always wanted to be useful. I'm so damn sorry for people, for almost everyone. I welcomed evolution like a long-lost brother. I thought I could do something to help it, perhaps. I imagined us all evoluting along into something magnificent. I didn't see any end to our possibilities. I agree with Al that if we got together, we could make a heavenly world out of this. But then Lance sprang this ice cap on me, and—" He paused. It was something pretty much like despair. Nothing seemed any use. The happier we got, the less we would want to be frozen, don't you see? She was terribly touched by the pain in his voice, by the suffering she divined in his queer soul. "But it's millions of years away," she said. "That doesn't matter as long as it's sure. We might find a way to live in it by the time it comes. It might even be a mistake. Lance couldn't be mistaken. You have only to look at him to know he's infallible. And have you seen their fossils and their reconstructed prehistoric animals? Those chaps know everything, Mammy, past, present, and future." "Come here," she said. "Sit beside me, dear." She drew his sleek head down on her breast. "Did this idea bring you to any sort of faith?" she asked. "No, Mammy, I simply felt that the ice cap ought to be kept a secret. I'd have been glad to be a martyr to humanity and kill all the scientists who knew about it. Only I knew more would crop up. I even thought of being a fake scientist myself and getting up something more cheerful, but that wouldn't get by." She cried over him a little, and he sat quite still, with his head resting on her shoulder. She wished so passionately that she had something to give him, some invincibly right word. "I think you'll get over this, dear boy," she said. "Of course I shall," he answered promptly. "I'll get fat and pompous in 15 years or so. You know that dish, Mammy, angels on horseback, oysters wrapped up in bacon? I'm in a hurry to wrap my little oyster of a soul in a lot of nice fat bacon. Then I'll be comfortable. Nothing better, is there, than making money and getting married?" "Don't be cynical," she said gently. "You know I'm not. I'm only trying to do what I can. I know what's good for me. Little Julia's good for me. She's all spirit, but it's the nice old-fashioned, hopeful kind. I never could tell her anything about the ice cap, for instance, nothing that would hurt her, and being by nature very candid, that'll help me to learn not to have anything to tell. I'll have to grow placid, don't you see?" He sat up and looked at her with his diabolic smile and his soft eyes. "Now then, will you tell father in some nice, mendacious way that I've got serious and want to settle down to something? Is it to be college or business?" "I think college," she said, smiling back at him. "You know, after all, Bertie, there may be something left for you to learn." "All right," he answered cheerfully, "and then come with me to see my pastry-cook's daughter." "But shouldn't you bring her here?" "I want you to see her in all her gorgeousness. But it isn't quite the thing. You see, you can't be actually engaged to her. She considers that we are. Anyway, their code of etiquette isn't inflexible. Please come, and look here, Mammy, if you don't like her, if you don't agree that I've done a masterly thing in getting her, I'll give her up." "I'll go, Bertie," she said, "but bear this in mind, dear boy. If you change your mind for any reason whatever about either of your plans, don't hesitate to say so. Don't go on in a wrong course, simply because you've entered upon it. You know I wouldn't, but this time I'm righter than I've ever been before." End of section 24. Section 25 of the Unlit Lamp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. The Unlit Lamp by Elisabeth Sanxay Holding. Chapter 8. Mutiny. 1. Andre was wandering about the second parlour that Sunday afternoon in a state of joyful idleness, humming to herself. It was so blissful to be at home again, now that the horrible shadow was lifted from her mother. She felt a new and precious sense of lightness and irresponsibility, a return of girlhood. She loved the old life, the kindly servants, the jolly breakfasts with Bertie and Edna. She was even ready to love the stuffy and decorous Sundays she had once found so hateful. Her father was sitting by the open window reading the paper because he looked just as he had always looked to her. She went over to him and kissed the top of his head. He glanced up and smiled. "Well," he said. "Well," she answered. "Are you happy? I am." They were thoroughly and beautifully reconciled now. In spite of his disappointment over the conduct of other people under the shadow of death, Gilbert knew that he had acted properly. He had forgiven his daughter, and he intended, in due course of time, to forgive his son-in-law. He had been profoundly affected by Claudine's illness. He had wished to be with her constantly, but she had not wanted him. She had turned always to André. He had certainly expected, although they had been more or less estranged for some years, that under the shadow of death she would come back to him. She should have said, "After all, we have lived more than 20 years together in storm and sunshine. Let us forget our differences." But she had not. She had said nothing at all, except to thank him for the profusion of flowers he sent. They hadn't had a single touching conversation. On that night which he had spent at her bedside, in agony and fear, she had not even seen him. She had lain gasping, exhausted, bathed in perspiration, with half-open eyes, as far away from him as if she were already dead. It was Edna who had consoled him and led him away, and it was André who had stayed by Claudine until the crisis was past. It was always André's name. It was always André's name, she had murmured. "André, baby, my baby." He had done his best to be just and temperate about this, but it hurt. And as she began to grow better and the danger was over, his old exasperation at her aloofness returned. He had really longed for a reconciliation. He would have told her frankly that he was sorry for many things in the past, and that he hoped with all his heart to understand her better in the future. It was his eternal passion for something perfect and beautiful in life. If only these 20 years could be crowned now with love, he could have been content. It was easy for him to forgive and forget the sins of other people as well as his own, but it was not easy for Claudine. He clung to her, for he had nothing else, but she had turned away from him to her children, and she had forgotten him. He had made a very thoughtful provision for her convalescence. He had learned from her lawyer that her old home in Staten Island, which her father had left her at his death, was temporarily vacant, and he had secured it for a year. Half of it, that is, for her father had converted it into a double house, an improvement by which she had profited, for she had received rent for both halves for years. With the help of Edna, he had removed from the storage warehouse as much of Mrs. Mason's old furniture as they thought good, and later in the spring, when Claudine was strong enough, she was to go there with Edna to find it all prepared for her. This plan had touched her. She had thanked him with tears in her eyes. He would have gone there with them if it had been suggested. "What's this?" asked André. He roused himself from his unpleasant meditation and turned to look at the object she held in her hand. "That? It's a game, Pigs in Clover. I remember your mother was very much amused with it when she was first married." André smiled and began to manipulate it, singing again. Now Gilbert had been brought up to distrust happiness, especially feminine happiness. His mother had never been happy. Claudine was never happy. The only permissible thing in that line was the benevolent and possibly alcoholically stimulated high spirits of the paterfamilias, coming home bearing gifts. He loved André. He was delighted to have the pretty, wilful creature about him again, but still he could not help distrusting such gaiety. "When do you expect to go home?" he asked. "This is home," said Andre. Your home is with your husband, young lady, he said severely. I know. I'm going pretty soon. There wasn't the slightest need or reason for staying another hour. She had been there for 4 weeks, and her mother was now well on the road to recovery. Al telephoned every day. First he asked about Claudine, whose illness he had taken terribly to heart, and then he always said, "When are you coming home, old girl?" And she always answered, "In a day or so." "You know your old father likes nothing better than to have his girl at home," Gilbert went on, "but you're a married woman and you have to think of your duty." "I do think of it, but not all the time. I think I'll run up and see if Mother's dressed." She had started up the stairs when the telephone rang, and she ran back to answer it. She was quite sure it would be Al. This was his regular hour. His voice responded. "Mrs. Stevens in?" "This is Andre," she answered brightly. "How are you, Alfred? Your mother doing well?" "Yes, very." And then, instead of his usual query, he said, "It's about time you were coming home, isn't it?" His voice was somewhat alarming, and she answered in her very pleasantest manner, "Yes, I'm coming in a day or two, Al." "Suppose you come this evening?" "Oh, I couldn't. Not possibly." "Why not? I'll come for you about 8. "No, Al, it's not possible. My things aren't packed." "Edna can pack them and send them after you tomorrow." "But how ridiculous. Why should I rush off like this?" "Well," he said very slowly, "suppose because I particularly ask you to." "You're very unreasonable." "Humour me then, for once." "No, Al," she said firmly, "I can't come tonight. Tomorrow or the next day. I'll let you know. Look here, Andre, I'm coming for you tonight. But I tell you, I'm not going home. I insist." She laughed. "What in the world is the matter with you, my dear boy? Do you imagine you can bully me?" "I don't want to. I'm asking you to do me a favour." "It's a ridiculous, selfish, unreasonable favour, and I shan't do it." "I'm coming for you just the same at 8 o'clock, he said. She was going to remonstrate with him, but she found that he had left the telephone. Her cheeks flushed and she bit her lip. "Little beast," she said to herself, but some secret thought made her unusually indulgent. She shrugged her shoulders and dismissed the thought of him. She went on up to her mother's room and knocked at the door. "It's Andre," she announced in her triumphal voice, as if that name were a talisman to admit her anywhere. Claudine was sitting at her dressing table brushing her hair. There was grey in it now on the temples, and her face was thin and drawn. She wore a negligee with high collar and long sleeves to conceal the pitiful emaciation of her neck and arms. Andre couldn't look at her without a twinge of pain. "I'll do your hair for you, darling," she said, and Claudine willingly relinquished the brush to her. "I am some use to you, aren't I, Mother? I don't know what I should have done without you, dear." "Should have done? Then you don't need me now? You know how dearly I love to have you with me, but I ought to go home. I'm not useful any more, and I'm not wanted. Don't be so unreasonable, my dear. It's only that I think it's unfair to Alfred." "Why?" she demanded impatiently. "You shouldn't stay away from him." "Why not? He's always saying he wants me to feel free. He certainly shouldn't object to my taking a little holiday. And you ought to be at your work again. I can practice here for Dr. Jas. The conservatory can wait." "You ought to go home," her mother repeated. Andre frowned. "Al's just been telephoning to insist upon my coming home this evening. I suppose you think he's right." "Yes." "You mean you'd like me to rush off like that?" "Yes, I should." "I shan't," said Andre. "I don't suppose you'll mind my waiting until tomorrow to pack my things." "If I were you, I should go with Alfred this evening. I wouldn't for anything just give in to his silly whim." "It's not a silly whim, Andre. I wrote to him." Andre stared at her mother's reflection in the glass. "What?" she cried. Claudine opened the drawer of the dressing table and looked into it. "I thought the sooner you went home, the better," she said in a low voice. Andre did not ask why. She understood very well. 2. It was a marvel to Claudine that no one else had noticed. There was a certain effrontery about them both, a smiling ease, but it should not have deceived Edna. She herself had observed it the first time she had gone downstairs and seen them together. Andre had been at the piano and Malloy standing by her to turn her music. She had looked up at him and met his eyes, and it was not possible for Claudine to doubt that they understood each other too well. She could not help watching them. Malloy was attentive to Edna, rather too much so, but it was with an air of bravado, of displaying his versatility, his irresistible fascination. With a sidelong glance he would follow Andre with his idiotic infatuation, his bedazzlement plain in his face. The very fact that they so seldom spoke to each other made her quite sure that there was a great deal of which she knew nothing. She regarded Andre's cool triumph with an aching heart. She was not shocked or astounded. It is a sad truth that no perfidy or evil could shock that woman. She was willing to believe both the best and the worst of anyone. Whatever was presented to her, she accepted. She believed that now she was seeking the very worst of Andre, the selfishness, the recklessness, the cruelty, which she knew better than anyone else. She didn't blame Malloy. Not much was to be expected from him. He was kind-hearted and manly and so on, but wax in hands like Andre's. He didn't love Andre. He wouldn't have thought of her if she hadn't made him. He had been happy with Edna, and he would be again if he were let alone. And Andre didn't love him. She would forget him if it was stopped now. That is the reason that Claudine had written to her son-in-law. "I really think, Alfred, that for several reasons it would be wise to induce Andre to go home to you as soon as possible and to take up her work again," she had written, and she had left it to his common sense to comprehend and to follow her hint. But she hadn't reckoned with his unruly passions. He had put 2 and 2 together to make a sum considerably more than 4. He had seen Malloy once in their sitting-room at the hotel, where he had come to sing for Andre. He had decidedly not liked him. "If he's engaged to Edna, or going to be, why does he hang around here?" he had asked. "I suppose he hasn't the same idea of etiquette as you," Andre had answered, with an unpleasant smile. "However, if you don't like him, I'll tell him not to come. He'll understand." She had intended to wound and anger him, and she had succeeded, but she had done something more. She had awakened in him that old and buried suspicion for women of Andre's class. Years before he had met Andre, that idea had been superseded. He had made his money and had begun to know at least a little of that other world, and he saw that the women there were no more or less than human beings, very much hampered and hurt by their idleness. He had tried to see in Andre not only the beloved woman, but a human being entitled to as many faults and weaknesses as he had himself, entitled to the same moderation of judgment that he himself required. He had deliberately put aside his suspicion of Malloy. He had conquered Andre's irritability with his patient good humour, and they had been getting along very nicely the week before Claudine's illness. And now, by the words of Claudine's letter, all fruits of his reason were destroyed, and the old distrust and envy and utter misunderstanding came rushing back. He saw Andre as a stranger of whom he knew really nothing, an unaccountable alien creature. He knew at once that Claudine's letter referred to Malloy. No doubt the fellow was hanging about the house there all the time, singing to her. It was on Saturday night that he got it. He had reflected upon it all that night, and the next morning, and by the afternoon, he was in a humour which would have caused Andre no little astonishment. He hated the Vincells and all their entourage. He believed that they were laughing at him, that he had been played with all these weeks, and now they fancied they had got well rid of him. All except Claudine. She wasn't like the others, of course. He wished that he could see her and talk to her, but that couldn't be. She had at least indicated to him what should be done. 3. At 8 o'clock he rang the doorbell. "I want to see Mrs. Stevens," he said curtly to the servant. "She's at supper, sir. Will you wait?" "No, just ask her to step here and speak to me." "What name, please, sir?" "Her husband," he said grimly. They were all in the dining room, enjoying the Sunday night tea of their tradition. Gilbert sat at the head of the table and made jokes, like a patriarch. Opposite him was Claudine, on one side Edna and Malloy, on the other Bertie and Andre. They lingered. They had not yet thought of rising from the table when the maid entered with her message. "Mr. Stevens is upstairs, ma'am," she whispered to Andre. "Who is it?" asked Gilbert in the tone of a man who is master in his own house. "Mr. Stevens, sir," answered the girl. He turned red. He was sorry he had asked. He was very much at a loss, and so was everyone else. This proscribed man actually under this roof. Gilbert was torn between his anger at the fellow's audacity and the respect due him as a husband. Propriety conquered. "Ask Mr. Stevens to come down here and join us," he said. "Bertie, bring up another chair to the table." But the girl returned almost immediately. "Mr. Stevens is sorry, sir, but he is in a hurry, and he would be obliged if Mrs. Stevens would come upstairs." Andre rose, but her expression alarmed her mother. "Andre," she murmured, but her warning was unheeded. Andre went slowly upstairs and into the hall where her husband stood waiting. He had not removed his felt hat, but he had thrown open the fur-lined overcoat of which he was so absurdly proud. Never had his appearance so profoundly displeased her. "What do you want?" she asked. Her tone excited him to instant hostility. "I told you I was coming," he said, "and I told you not to come." She looked at him. "I didn't even think that you would do a thing like this. Coming here, waiting in the hall like a servant with a message. That's enough," he said. "I only want to know whether you're coming back or not. When I'm ready, I'll come. I'm ready now. I've waited as long as I'm going to wait." "Are you trying to threaten me?" she asked with cold surprise. "No, I'm simply giving you your choice, to come with me or to stay." "I'll stay, thank you," she said. She had a sudden impulse of pity for him. He looked so desolate and lost. She thought it would be nice to have her cake and also to eat it. "Let's not quarrel," she said. "Come downstairs and have supper with us." "No," he said. "I'm going." The servants delivered his message. He opened the door and went out, slamming it after him with a crash. Andre struggled against a great desire to cry or to shout after him, she didn't know which. "Little beast," she said aloud. "Vulgar little bully." "What's the meaning of this?" said a severe voice behind her, and she turned to see her father. "There's no meaning in it at all," she answered. "Al's gone home, that's all. Did you quarrel, Andre?" She was surprised. She had forgotten that fathers were supposedly authorized to ask such impertinent questions. "No," she said. "He thought I would come home this evening, but I wasn't ready." Gilbert saw some feminine mutiny in this. "Did you refuse to accompany him?" he asked in a portentous voice. "Yes," she answered, "of course I did. Is that a crime? Am I supposed to humour every caprice?" Gilbert stopped her with a gesture. He put himself in Alfred's place. He knew how he would have felt under the circumstances, how humiliated and furious. "No doubt he had very good reasons. You've already remained away for over 5 weeks." 4 weeks. 4 weeks, then. You have, in my opinion, you have neglected him. Andre made no defence, but her air was not acquiescent. Gilbert became more fatherly. "Now, I'll tell you what you'll do, Andre. Telephone your husband and tell him you'll be home in an hour or so, and I'll take you myself and make the young man's acquaintance. Eh?" "No, thank you, father. I'm not ready to go." "Get ready, then. Get ready. Bertie will telephone for you. Bertie," he called. "Bertie, just a moment, please." Bertie came running upstairs. "Your sister's going home." "I'm not," said Andre. Gilbert was astounded. "This is a serious matter," he said. "I can't permit it. It's your duty to go home to your husband." "I'll just postpone the duty for a few days," said Andre. "I say no. He came for you this evening and—" "What is the matter?" asked Claudine's low voice. She had come up after Bertie and was standing in the shadow, outside the circle of light, cast by the lamp on the newel post. "I am telling Andre that she must go home tonight. It seems her husband came to fetch her, and she refused to go with him." "She'll go tomorrow," said Claudine. "It's rather late now." "Father," said Andre, "I don't want to be rude, but it's my own affair. I can't let anyone tell me what I shall do. I'll go home when I think best." "This is outrageous," shouted Gilbert. "You can't adopt that tone toward me, young woman. You've been spoiled and indulged long enough. Bertie, go down to the garage and bring the car." "No," cried Claudine. "Do as I tell you. Now, Andre, I'll give you 15 minutes to pack what you need, and then you'll go, ready or not. This is my house, and what I say shall be done. Do you understand?" "I believe I do," she answered carelessly. "You're putting me out, aren't you? Very well, I'll go." She turned and ran up the stairs. Claudine turned upon Gilbert with desperation. "Gilbert, go after her. Tell her she can wait. Tell her I'll do nothing of the sort," he answered. "I won't be defied in my own house." She seized his arms with her weak hands and actually tried to shake him. "Stop her," she cried. "Stop her. You don't realize what you're doing." He looked down at his wife with stupefaction. "Stop her," she cried again. "Go after her and tell her to wait." "You ought to be ashamed of yourself," he said severely, to suggest, but she didn't wait for him to finish. "Then I'm going with her," she said. With trembling knees she ascended the stairs, entered her room and began dressing. She hastily put into a little bag a few necessary clothes, her jewel case and her bank books, and came out again just as Andre had gone downstairs. "Gilbert," she whispered to her husband, "I must stay with her until they are reconciled. It's a matter of vital importance." He was touched. She was so ill, so weak, so terribly upset. "Very well," he said. "Bertie will take you to their house. Take care of yourself. You're not fit to go out." She gave him a hasty kiss and, taking Bertie's arm, left the house. Andre was already in the street, standing beside the car. "I'll have to drive you," said Bertie. Donald was out. "But you won't drive me home, my child," said Andre. "You can take me to some other hotel." "Take her wherever she wants, Bertie," said Claudine with a sob. End of section 25. Section 26 of The Unlit Lamp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. The Unlit Lamp by Elisabeth Sanxay Holding, Section 26. Chapter 9. Home Again. 1. Claudine sat down to answer her distressing correspondence. She took a long time to arrange her writing materials, to adjust the light, for her heart failed her. Courage and hope were nearly gone. She sat before the same little rosewood desk she had used in her girlhood. In that little bedroom she had passed so many happy years in. She was at home again, in the house in which she had been born, and she had at this moment no better wish than she might die there. She had brought Andre here the day after their flight, nearly a month ago. She had felt a presumptuous and sublime joy. For the first time in her life, she was going to have Andre alone there in that house of gentle memories. She would take her for walks, show her the places she had so loved in her own young days. She would soften her heart and win her utterly. She would teach her to see the worth of her husband, the sacredness of their bond. With all her love, all her sad wisdom, she would lead her back from this morass into which she had strayed. She had felt sure that she could do this, now that they were alone. Andre was susceptible. She could be persuaded. She had shown a passionate affection for her mother. She had wept in her arms that night. She had accused herself of selfishness and ingratitude. There had been just 2 days of paradise, 2 long days spent together in exquisite companionship. The granddaughter of Selma, Mrs. Mason's most devoted old servant, had come to wait on them, and she made them entirely comfortable. There was nothing to worry or disturb them. They had had their meals together alone, and quiet evenings in the drawing-room before a fine log fire. They hadn't mentioned Andre's affair. Claudine was content to wait for that, filled with hope by her child's new softness. And then, on the 3rd evening, Malloy came. Evidently Andre had sent for him, for she greeted him without surprise. He was troubled, anxious, very ill at ease. He had the unmistakable air of a man tormented by an unwelcome passion. He was afraid of Claudine. He was ashamed of his treachery to Edna. He was ashamed of his terrible bondage. But he could not escape. Andre's mocking smile turned his heart to water. He adored her. He was unable to hide his madness. Andre didn't attempt to see him alone. She brought him into the room where her mother sat before the fire, and kept him there. She asked him to sing, and he did so. His fervent and touching voice sounded through the firelit room, and moved the wretched mother to tears. What was she to do? She could see him with Andre's eyes. She could so easily understand what it was that had captured that reckless and beauty-loving heart. He was so handsome, so ardent, so entirely a lover. He had none of Alfred's preoccupations. He hadn't, she thought, any thoughts at all, nothing but sentiments and traditions, but a gallant gentleman. He left early. It certainly had not been a pleasant evening for him. He had scarcely been able to speak with Claudine present. But when he was going and had said good night to Andre, who hadn't risen, she followed him out to the front door. "Mr. Malloy," she said, "have you told Edna?" "No," he said. "I'm ashamed to say I haven't. But of course I shall." "Don't," she entreated. "Please don't. Not just yet. If you can, won't you go to see her as usual?" "But do you think that's honourable?" he asked, shocked. "It's kind, Mr. Malloy. But isn't it only putting it off, you know?" "Sometimes it's better to do that," she said. "Please, Mr. Malloy, if you are able to." "I'll try," he said quite miserably. "I suppose you don't want me to say anything until you're home again?" "Yes," she answered. The door closed behind him. "Because I'm going to stop this," she said to herself. "It can't be. I'm going to stop it. That was her one object, that nothing irreparable should be said or done. She was absolutely certain that the infatuation would not last. There was not one element in it to make it permanent. She was certain that if no monstrous, irrevocable folly was committed, Malloy would thankfully return to Edna, who really suited him, and that Andre would go back to her husband. But she was filled with terror at the possibility of that evil chance. She lay awake all that night, trying to plan how she could prevent it. No enlightenment came. Malloy came again and again. She dreaded to speak to Andre, for she knew how speech solidifies and strengthens the vaguest thoughts. But it could no longer be avoided. She could no longer be complacent. She waited until Andre was in bed one night, and then she went into her room and sat beside her in the dark, at the foot of her bed. "Andre," she said, "I must know." "I want you to, Mother. I've been waiting for you to ask me." She sat up and flung her arms round her mother. "Oh, my darling," she said, "I'm so terribly, terribly sorry. I know I've made you suffer. I know it's a dreadful thing to do to dear little Edna, but I can't help it. I thought at first it would only be a lark. I didn't mean any harm. I never imagined this would come. But now it's too late. I love him so, Mother. I never knew what love was before. I never felt like this about Al. Oh, Mother, I'd stop if I could. I don't want to hurt you or Edna, but I can't help it." "You can, Andre. It's not necessary to do what you want. You're so cold and so good, you can't understand. I love Francis so that I can't give him up, no matter what harm it does to me or anyone else. What do you intend to do?" "I've written to Al to ask him for a divorce." "Oh," cried her mother, "why did you do that?" "What else could I do? You didn't think I wanted a nasty, underhand intrigue, did you, Mother? I wouldn't even kiss Francis until I was free from Al. I'm not that sort." "What did Alfred say?" "Nothing. He didn't answer. But I know he'll do it. He's always said he'd never try to hold me if I wanted to be free." "I think you ought to see him, my child." "Why?" Claudine had no intention of telling her true reason. "It's the best and frankest way to do," she said. "If you like, I will write to him and ask him to come here. I wish you would see him. For my sake, Andre." Andre sighed. "I will then, if you like, Mother, but it'll be horrible. Will be horrible. We'll quarrel. All his commonness comes out when he's angry. You needn't quarrel. Then it's agreed that I'm to write." "Yes," said Andre, "but it's not a bit of use to try your diplomacy, Mother dear. I see through you." And this very evening she was trying to write that letter. Andre and Malloy were sitting on the porch, almost under her window. Now and then she could hear the murmur of their voices. "I'll write the other letters first," she decided in despair. She wrote to Gilbert the same sort of thing she had been writing all the month. "I think it is very necessary to stay with Andre until she and her husband are reconciled. It is a critical time. I hope and believe that all will turn out well." He, of course, knew nothing at all of the Malloy complication. He believed it to be a simple quarrel. Then she wrote to Edna. "My dear little girl, it is always a pleasure to receive one of your cheerful letters. I can't thank you enough for taking such good care of Father, Bertie, and Cousin Lance. I am very glad you like Bertie's Julia. She is a charming little creature and very devoted to him. Your description of their ball was amusing and I thought rather touching. Bertie had told me of Mr. Santy's predilection for wizards. I think I should enjoy them myself. Your dress must have been lovely. I am sorry your father thought it too short. Personally, I think that style suits you. You don't look any older than when you were a little girl going to dancing school. Write to me often, my dear little Edna, and don't expect any news from me, because there is none. I am very much better. You are not to worry. As soon as this most unfortunate affair is settled, I shall be home again. Very lovingly and gratefully, your mother. P.S. Be sure to send the furs to cold storage this week. She looked again at the little pile of letters she had had from Edna, gay, pleasant, commonplace, and yet alarming. There was not a single mention of Malloy. Edna was not one to wear her heart on her sleeve. She had no ability and no desire for expressing her emotions. Her mother blessed her for her seemly reticence. How easy it was to deal with people who didn't talk, who took so much for granted. She was quite certain that the poor little thing was very unhappy, but she was also certain that she was not desperate. She had no doubt noticed the change in her handsome lover, but she wished no consoling for it. She would console herself. She would endure with dignity and common sense. And now for Alfred. She hesitated for a long time, then began to write in her careful and delicate hand. My dear Alfred, I have just learned of Andre's decision, and I think I need not tell you how it grieved me. Not only on your account, but on hers. I believe that a divorce would be a terrible mistake, and I beg you to oppose it resolutely. I beg of you, Alfred, not to consent to it. No one understands Andre as I do, and I know that this would be the very worst thing possible for her. She has consented to see you, and I entreat you to come and talk it over with her. I trust to your deep affection for her and to your humanity. I know that she can never be happy and safe with anyone but you. Will you come on Sunday, if convenient for you? Always your friend, Claudine Vincel. She stamped and sealed it and lay down on the bed to read, to try to read, and to forget her bitter anxiety. 2. Sunday came and no word from him, and on Sunday evening Mr. Malloy appeared. Claudine was very much taken aback. He had never before come on Sunday, and she had very humanly taken it for granted that he never would. She hadn't told Andre that she expected Alfred. She had planned to take her by surprise before she could adopt a difficult and dangerous mood. If he should come now! She sat upstairs in her room in a state of tremulous agitation, looking out of her window, trying in vain to see the street through the fog that had risen, listening for his footfall, though what she could do to forestall him she didn't know. Outside on the porch, Andre and Malloy were sitting, well wrapped, coat collars turned up against the thick, chill mist of that April night. Their hands were clasped, but they spoke very little. They were in a mood of sombre depression, not unknown to lovers. Now and then Claudine heard the sound of their voices, forlorn and detached. If it had been Alfred, she thought, how different it would have been. A continuous flow of talk and retorts from Andre, irritated perhaps, but certainly interested. She fancied she heard a footstep on the hilly street. She opened her window softly and leaned out. The trees were dripping on the gravel drive. Hoarse whistles sounded from the bay. And yes, undoubtedly, that was the garden gate. A step on the porch, and Andre's voice. "I want to see Mrs. Vincel." She flew down the stairs and opened the front door. "Come in, Alfred," she said. He followed her into the sitting-room and stood before her, still in his overcoat and cap. "So she's out there with him," he said. "Do you think that's a fair way to treat me?" "I'm sorry, Alfred, very sorry. I had no idea he would come this evening. I wouldn't for worlds have. He does come to see her then, in your house, and you don't mind?" "Please sit down," she said gently. "I am so glad you came. I wanted so to talk to you, to explain." He took off his overcoat and cap and threw them on a chair. He was thinner. His face had lost its boyish and alert expression. It was set in an expression of bitterness and misery. "I didn't want to come," he said. "It can't do any good. I knew what you thought would happen. You thought if we saw each other we'd melt, that she'd change her mind. Well, I don't want that. We've had enough emotion. I don't want any love that comes from caprice. No more moods and impulses. It wasn't that way with me. It was real. Alfred, you mustn't be hard. It's not like you. If you love her, you must forgive her 100 times. She's silly and... It's not a question of forgiving. I don't see it that way. She's free to do as she pleases. It's simply that now I know she's not capable of loyalty. Alfred, I give you my word. There's been nothing wrong. Oh, I believe it. She's respectable, he said bitterly. I'm not afraid of her being too generous with anyone. She'll be like some of those singers and geniuses I've read of. She'll have 6 husbands, but she'll never do anything wrong. That's very cruel and unjust. Surely you've seen enough of the world to understand these infatuations. He's a very handsome and attractive man, and she has lost her head. That's all it is. It won't last. I know it won't, but it will happen again. It isn't the infatuation that hits me so hard. I can understand that. It could happen to almost anyone. But it's the rank beastly cruelty of it, to walk off and leave me without a word. You don't know, leaving all her little things there, all her little things, telling me all the time she'd come back in a few days. He got up and walked over to the fire. No, he said, she can have her divorce. I always told her I'd never try to keep her against her will, but I wish to God we'd never got married. If we could only part now with some sort of decency, if she could just say, it's over, goodbye. But now I guess you don't realize I'll have to be caught in a compromising situation. All the dirty, filthy business will have to be written down and talked about by a lot of lawyers. The sort of thing I hate worse than death. It's what they call acting honourably for me to do that. Don't do it, Alfred. Don't do it, I beg you. I'm sure she loves you. She has a damn peculiar way of loving, then. I know she has. There are horrible things in her nature, but I'm sure that you know the good in her too. She is honest and... She covered her face with her hands. Can't you see, Alfred? She needs you so. No one else can help. No one else can help her to grow into something better. Please don't cry, he said in great distress. I'd do anything for you. You're an angel. I'm not. I once, long ago, thought I'd leave my husband, but thank God I didn't. But it might have been better for you if you had, he said frankly. She looked up in surprise. No, she said. It would have been, I am sure, but self-sacrifice is the best way in life. That depends on the object. If you sacrifice yourself for, well, humanity, it's fine and good. But for one other human being? No. She had no intention of permitting an argument to begin. She pulled the conversation away from reason back to emotion, where it belonged. I don't ask you to sacrifice yourself, Alfred. It would make you both happy. I can't do it, he said quietly. She wants to leave me, and I must let her. But you'll see her. No, please don't ask me any more. It's settled. I'm sorry on your account. I should be glad to do it for you if I could, but I can't. He went toward the chair where his coat lay and was about to put it on when the door opened and André entered. He turned and faced her. Her cheeks were rosy from the damp air, her black hair curled about her forehead. Her mother looked at her loveliness with a beating heart. Surely he could not resist her. But he picked up his cap and threw his coat over his arm. Good night, he said. The front door closed after him. 3. Not 15 minutes ahead of him, Malloy was making his way to the ferry. My God, what a mess, he was saying over and over to himself. He had never in his life felt so shabby, so shamefaced as he had felt that evening. There was no triumph in this love. He was a thief. He had mortally stricken that poor little chap. He had humiliated and hurt Edna. He had involved himself and André in a disgusting scandal. We can never be happy, he said, not on such a foundation. But I don't care. I'd rather have her and be miserable all my life. End of section 26. Section 27 of the Unlit Lamp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. Chapter 10. Destiny Intervenes. 1. Andre was very late that evening. She had gone to the city to do some shopping, and at 8 o'clock she had not yet returned. Claudine sat down to supper alone, but she could not eat. She was filled with apprehension. She couldn't imagine what was keeping Andre. The weather had suddenly turned mild. The dining room windows were open, and a sweet, damp breeze was blowing in from the garden. Rose had prepared an especially appetizing supper. She hovered about the silent woman, very anxious that she should eat it. The shaded lamp threw a warm light on the table, set out with Mrs. Mason's glowing old Crown Derby. There was the same order and quiet all about her that had so delighted her a few weeks ago. But now it frightened her. It was death-like. There's no use trying to go on, she thought. This must end. I'll have to tell Gilbert and poor little Edna. I'll have to go back. I've done all I can. It was nearly a week since Alfred had come, and in the meantime Andre had begun her divorce proceedings. No miracle had happened. Heaven had not intervened. This disaster, this ruin was approaching with a sure step. "I really don't believe I can eat, Rose," she said apologetically. "I'm sorry. Your little supper was so nice. Be sure to put something aside for Mrs. Stevens." "I think I hear a taxi coming now, Mom," said Rose. They both listened. Rose was right. A taxi was stopping outside the house. A man's voice said, "Thank you, miss," and there was a step on the veranda. Rose hurried to open the door, and in an instant Andre entered the room. Claudine sprang up. "What is the matter?" she cried, alarmed at her child's face. Andre at once began to cry hysterically. "Stop, child," said her mother. "What is it? What has happened?" Andre sank into a chair by the table and leaned her head on her arms, shaking with sobs. "It's too much," she cried. "Go away, Rose," said Claudine. "Go into the kitchen and make Mrs. Stevens a nice hot cup of tea." Rose vanished. "What is it, Andre?" she asked again. "Don't torture me so. What has happened?" Andre sat up suddenly and began to laugh through her sobs. "I went to see Dr. Lawrence," she cried. "I was afraid. It's true. There's going to be a baby." She began to shriek with laughter. Claudine seized her by the shoulders and shook her. Be quiet, Andre. Come upstairs." Andre shook her head. "No," she cried. "No, I'm expecting company. Francis is coming. Oh, Lord, isn't it funny? Won't he be pleased?" "Hush, come upstairs," Claudine repeated, and half dragged her to her feet. She put her arm about her and supported her up the stairs to her own room. "Lie down," she said. "I'll bathe your face in cold water. Try to control yourself, Andre." But Andre could do nothing but weep and laugh. Claudine sat by her, patting her cold hands and stroking her hair, silent, waiting for her to become tranquil. The doorbell rang and Andre sprang up, suddenly sobered. "Mother, it's Francis. You'll have to see him." "We'll tell Rose to say you're not at home." "No, I want to see him. Listen, Mother." "Yes?" Andre looked at her with a stern glance. "You'll have to send him away," she said. "Tell him it's all over. I'll never see him again." "Do you mean that, Andre?" "It would hardly do to introduce a little Stevens into our household," said Andre with a frigid smile. "But what shall I say?" "I don't care. Anything. Only, Mother, if you ever let him guess the truth, I'll never, never forgive you. My life is ruined. I've got to give him up. But it's so ridiculous and humiliating. No one must ever know." "But they can't help knowing." "Francis won't. He's stupid." "He won't put two and two together." Tell him anything. Say I've repented on account of Edna. Only get rid of him, for God's sake. Hush, Andre. Oh, I'm so ashamed and wretched. Why did this horrible thing happen? I wouldn't believe it at first. It was too ridiculous and shameful. I won't have Francis know. I'll go away somewhere. Claudine rose. You'll lie here quietly, won't you? She asked. Andre assured her that she would, and closing the door after her, Claudine descended the stairs. Of all the painful and awkward tasks she had yet had to do for her child, this was the worst. She couldn't suppress a wry little smile. She, who so loved peace and dignity, who was so constitutionally averse to plain speaking. Mr. Malloy was in the drawing-room walking about. He stared a little at the sight of Claudine. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening," Claudine answered brightly. How was she to begin? She stood quite still, and her silence warned him of something unpleasant to come. "It's very difficult," she said. "Please sit down, Mr. Malloy." He did so, and she seated herself opposite him. I must be very firm, she thought. If I only can get rid of him. He waited for some time. "I hope there's nothing wrong, Mrs. Vincel," he said at last. "No, I should not call it wrong. Indeed, I think I won't try to conceal from you, Mr. Malloy, that all this has been very painful for me. I have always had the greatest respect for Andre's husband, and I thought it a terrible mistake for her to leave him." He flushed. "I'm sorry," he said. "Naturally, I think first of her. I knew that this was not for her good. I knew, please forgive me, I knew she wouldn't be happy with you, but I couldn't stop her. She is very willful." But she has changed, Mr. Malloy. She sees now that she was wrong. She has asked me to tell you so." He rose. "No," he cried, "no, it's impossible." "She asked me to tell you. She could not bear to do so herself. She and I too, Mr. Malloy, we both rely upon your fine feeling to understand and to go away." "But I can't believe it. Why, only 3 days ago—" "I know, but you must believe me. It's so hard to tell you. She doesn't wish to see you again. Please let me see her. She doesn't want to see you. I am sure you will understand that it is best so." "What has happened? What has made her change?" "It is impossible to say. A change of heart. But I beg you to accept this as final, and to go." "Very well," he said. "I'll go." She held out her hand to him. "Mr. Malloy," she said, "can't all this be as if it had never happened?" "I don't see how," he said. "I'm afraid I can't forget so easily. But some day I hope you will marry happily, and—" He shook his head. "You will," she assured him. "You are too much of a man to let this really hurt you. If you cannot have exactly what you want, you must—" She stopped in confusion, and suddenly, in some inexplicable way, he guessed her meaning. He was astounded. "You don't mean—" he began. "Edna?" "Yes," she murmured. "But after I've deceived her so? The only question is, if you care for her." "I do. I always have. Not as I did for Andre, but she's the finest and truest girl in the world. I can't tell how unutterably ashamed I've been of the way I've behaved toward her." "Repair it. Don't you see that I can't? She doesn't know, does she?" "No, but she suspected that there's something wrong." "It's not too late. If you really care for her, if you're really sorry for what you've done—" "I do care for her, too much to make a second best of her." "Oh, stupid, stupid," she cried to herself. "What does it matter?" He went on in a horrified voice. "You surely wouldn't recommend a marriage founded on a deception." A cynical thought occurred to her. "They're all founded on deceptions," she reflected, "on lies that people believe about each other. I'm not recommending anything, she said aloud. I only want to say again that I'm very sorry for all this, Mr. Malloy. He went away down the little garden walk for the last time. She's not the high-minded woman I thought her, he reflected. Her ideas are absolutely sordid. And then he forgot her in his profound sorrow. Claudine remained for a moment in the drawing-room. He'll go back to Edna, she said to herself. I'm glad. He'll do as well as anyone else. He's kind and rather attractive. She won't expect too much. 2. She was just falling asleep that night after having seen Andre comfortably settled. She was mortally weary, unable to think. She had a light burning low, as was her reprehensible custom, and she had a book beside her in case she could not sleep. But in spite of her trouble, the murmur of the night wind soothed her, and the air blowing across her face. She had closed her eyes, and a blissful numbness was stealing over her when she was startled by Andre's voice. "Mother!" she cried. "Mother!" She was instantly wide awake. Andre stood beside her like a spectre in the dim light, in her nightdress and her dark hair about her shoulders. "I want Alfred," she said. "Oh, Mother, I began to think." Claudine took her dressing gown from the foot of the bed and laid it about her child's shoulders. "I've been so wicked," she went on. "It frightens me. I want Al back. I want to see his kind face. He's so kind and so good. I want to go home to him. I want just him and this baby. Please, please send for him." "I will, Pet, as soon as it's morning." "I can't wait. I'm so unhappy. I want to hear his dear, kind voice." "Come in here and lie down beside me, darling. Talk to me." With that beloved head on her shoulder, Claudine grew calm and strong again. She would have listened to her all night. What did it matter if this were only a new caprice? It was a good one, a safe one. She thought of her own life, of how her child had assuaged her bitterness and given her peace. She thought of the hopes she had relinquished, such little hopes compared with Andre's inordinate ambitions, and she believed that all that was to happen again. Andre would be saved if she would love her child better than herself, and she believed that this would happen. She looked very earnestly into her face. It was imperious, even cruel, but it was the cruelty of blindness, of one who inflicts suffering without knowing what suffering is. She didn't care in the least that Andre's brilliant future was endangered. She didn't care how fettered and narrow her life might become. Better narrow and deep, she thought, than broad and shallow. She listened quite unmoved to her child's tears and sobs. It didn't matter. She kissed her with a sublime sort of indifference. She had won. God had helped her, and she had won. 3. Alfred came promptly the next morning, and Andre received him alone. "Al," she said, "can we make a new start?" He didn't look at her. When Claudine had telephoned so urgently for him to come, he had expected something of this sort. "I suppose we could make any number of them," he said. "The question is, would there be any use in it?" "You said, I know all that I said. I said you could be free whenever you wanted, and that implied the same thing for me, Andre." "I don't want to be free." "Why don't you?" "Because I want—" She held out her arms, her eyes filled with tears, but he did not move toward her. "Al," she cried, "do please come here." "No," he said, "let's not complicate the thing with that. Just tell me what's changed you. I'm here to listen." "Suppose it was only that I'd found out I was wrong, and that I missed you and wanted you back. Wouldn't that be enough? Haven't you missed me?" In spite of himself, he was touched. "I won't pretend I haven't. It was a bit of a shock to me, you know. I'd never expected anything like that. I thought that we were so close, nothing could come between us. Couldn't you forget it? Al, it's hard for me to beg like this. I can't say anything more. I only ask you if you're willing to start again." That was a voice which he found it hard indeed to withstand, a face that moved him beyond measure. yet he was passionately anxious that no new mistake should be made. "But what guarantee would we have that we'd do any better?" he cried. "I think," she began, "I think it would be different now." "But why, Andre? Do you see things differently? I mean," she had begun to cry a little. "You see, Al, there's going to be a baby." "What?" he cried. His face had turned quite pale. "What? My God, really?" "Very really," she answered with a faint smile. He sprang up and caught her in his arms in a sort of desperation. "Oh, Andre, I'm so sorry, my lovely, beautiful girl. I'm so sorry." "Don't," she cried. "You make it worse. Be glad, can't you? I thought you would be. I thought everyone would be simply beaming. I wanted you to be." "I'm not," he said doggedly. "I love you too much." "Do you?" she said triumphantly. "Now you've got it out of me," he said. "I knew you would. Yes, I do love you. Too much, I guess. I don't want anyone but you, ever." "Oh, Al, Al, it's so heavenly to have you back again, and hear you again, and see you with your dear old rumpled hair. There's no one like you." "I wish to God you didn't have this before you," he said somberly. "But I'm glad, Al," she told him. "It's life." End of section 27.
Section 28 of the Unlit Lamp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Unlit Lamp by Elisabeth Sanxay Holding. Epilogue. 1. It struck Claudine with the force of a blow. She put down the book, and the night wind at once fluttered over the pages, as if by command of nature trying to divert her. But she turned back to the place again, all her heart fixed on the words like the eyes of a frightened child fixed upon an approaching light. She did not all at once grasp the meaning, but the significance was coming to her, illuminating and dispelling a familiar dusk, revealing to her what had always been there, but what she had not seen. She had been turning over the pages of an old copy of Browning's poems, given her by Lance years ago, because he had fancied that so small and delicate and pretty a creature must necessarily feed on poetry. As a matter of fact, she had never been poetic, not even very romantic. She had always had a love for indigestible ideas which had, in the main, done her very little harm. She might read Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. She remained none the less the Claudine who could wander gay and happy in a garden. And now suddenly stood up this robust dead poet to look into her soul and accuse her, to judge and condemn her. The thing had all the solemn horror of what her ancestors would have called the voice of an awakened conscience. It was the handwriting on the wall. The sin I impute to each frustrate ghost is the unlit lamp in the ungirt loin. Through the end in sight was a vice, I say. That was for her. That was an arrow for her heart. She was quite alone in the house. Rose had gone out to the lodge meeting of the Lady Pioneers. Claudine was always glad to let her go. She was never so happy as when alone with her ghosts. When the stairs creaked, that was the stout figure of her mother in dull black silk, going about her benevolent household affairs. There was a rustle of paper. That was the boy Lance studying in his room upstairs. A faint tapping. That was her father emptying his pipe. The wind blowing across the garden brought back to her unblemished the old emotions, the sheltered security, that careless and formless hope that had filled her girlhood. She would forget, alone in her room, the reality she had found so bitter. But to be a ghost among those other ghosts, that frightened her. She looked about the quiet lamp-lit room. In the bookcase her old books, on the walls her old pictures, on the bureau the photographs of her father and mother, and a pitiful little bottle of that cherry blossom perfume. Only the old things. It was as if 20 years had been a dream. She was aware that she had tried to make them so, that she had tried with desperation not to live. Blasphemous effort, rewarded now by this numb anguish. "A frustrate ghost!" she cried aloud, and her voice seemed to have no sound. She had a preposterous idea that she was invisible and inaudible, that there was nothing in this room but the memory of her. She was only her own dream. She sprang up to look in the mirror, and saw there a white face and wide eyes, an apparition. The wind blowing on her was suddenly chill, like a cold breath. "No, no," she said. "Oh, no, I want to be alive." There was for once no solace for her in that dear garden. She closed the window and pulled down the blind, to shut away the dark and the troubling sounds. She sat down and clasped her trembling hands. She tried to see herself once more in the stream of life. Let it be never so cold and violent. She thought of André, nothing but pain in that thought. Poor young André and her poor little baby. Poor Al. She thought of Edna, hiding under her tranquillity and unforgettable humiliation, of Bertie with his gallant despair, of Gilbert, unaccountably forlorn. There was a thin veil hung between her and these living, struggling creatures. She could see them, but could not reach them. She fancied them being swept past her and calling to her and needing her, while she looked on, standing apart. "Oh, why haven't I done something? Why haven't I helped?" she demanded of her shrinking heart. And the inexorable response was, "Begin now." But remorse came easier than effort. She passionately condemned herself. She saw herself an egoist. In her young days she had been gay and gracious because she had had what she wanted, and when that had been withdrawn from her, she had grown cold, aloof, finding peace in indifference. She thought of all that she might have done, of the influence she might have exerted. Not that she believed herself stronger or wiser than these 4 adult human beings for whom she felt responsible. It was a mystic belief in the power of a woman and a mother. She was convinced that she could give more than was in her, more than she had. She loathed herself for not having done so. She believed, as was natural, that if she had tried she must have succeeded. She knew that in her garden everything grew only according to its type. She believed, nevertheless, that human creatures might be so warmed by her love, so nourished by her tears, that they would grow not according to any laws, but according to her own desires. She felt that this was the turning point in her life. She had wasted 20 years, dreamed them away. Only God knew how few or how many remained to her. She was making the most painful effort of her life. It was not a struggle. She wished it were. It was an attempt to struggle. The lamp must be lit, the loin girded. She must no longer pass among the living as a gentle phantom. She must help all these people who belonged to her. She must, by her valor and devotion, compensate for what they were denied. She must inspire and fortify. But what was there to breathe life into her? Love, even such love as she had for André, had not done it. She was not religious. She could not turn to prayer. And her philosophers had nothing at all to give her. She sat up almost all that night, trying to fan her shrinking and mutinous spirit into a blaze. Her life should be service. She clung to that idea. It was the inevitable moment to everyone whose work is finished, to women whose children have grown. It was a little death. But she did not recognize it as that. She felt it to be a spiritual rebirth. The world was empty, and she was obliged to fill it with herself. And she was by no means large enough. 2. She telephoned to Gilbert in his office the next morning. She was so affable that he was upset. She should have been home long ago, anyhow, instead of staying down there alone on Staten Island in that peculiar way. He felt that she was trying to be ingratiating, and this, of course, aroused his hostility and distrust. Her quiet, clear voice reaching him in the midst of his morning mail caused him all the usual feelings of annoyance induced by any thought of home life. She asked him about his health, and he knew she didn't care. She even asked that supremely irritating question, "How is business?" Well, did he know why his family asked that? Then, amazingly, she said, "If you're not too tired, Gilbert, won't you come down here for dinner? The garden is so lovely." "Suppose you come home," he said surlily, but it was only an instinctive reaction, the bear hitting out with his paw. "Do come," she said pleasantly. "It would be nice to be by ourselves. And the garden." Very well, he said. "I'll come. I can't spend the morning at the telephone. I'll come, Claudine. Good-bye." Now this disturbed him. He was inclined to suspect, with reason, all advances made by his family, and yet he liked these advances. He felt fairly sure that his wife had some favor to ask, some feminine chicanery to execute. But he was like a king with his courtiers. He was grimly contemptuous of all this beguilement, but he relished the homage. The idea of going back to that house on the hill to see Claudine stirred in him old and unpleasant memories. He felt himself no phantom. He was poignantly aware of the passing of 20 years and youth with them. He didn't feel that he had not tried, but that he had not succeeded. He had made money, just as he intended, but the rewards of his activity had been unjustly withheld. He had the wrong sort of wife, the wrong sort of children, the wrong sort of life altogether. Still, he would do the right thing, as he had always done. He stopped on his way to the ferry and bought Claudine a 5-pound box of chocolates, the kind she hated most and which he had brought for years and years, never being undeceived. 3. But long before he got there, all Claudine's plans had been upset. She had gone about all the morning, seriously intent upon her scheme to win back her husband. This, she felt, was the first step along her new road. Once he was back, she would make him into something different, as it was her womanly duty to do. She would take him to concerts and persuade him to read. She had that idea common to good and inexperienced women, of the fascination she might wield if she chose, an idea in no way related to vanity, but a conception necessary to existence. She had never yet consciously tried to be fascinating, but at the back of her mind had always been the thought of how powerful she might be, if she weren't so nice. She was obliged to believe this. If Gilbert, by analogy, had realized when he went out to lunch that perhaps 7 out of 10 men that he passed could have knocked him flat on his back, he couldn't have endured life. He had to believe that he could hold his own, if he wanted, and she, too, must have her belief in her mystic power. She had been sitting down to a delightful, solitary lunch. The dining room, with its shining waxed floor and well-polished mahogany furniture, the yellow roses in a great Delft bowl, the dim, cool peace all about her, filled her with serenity and courage. Certainly she would change Gilbert and everything else in her life. She intended to ask him to stop here with her for the rest of the summer, a real sacrifice, for it meant the end of this delicate and immaterial existence, and a hateful preoccupation with roasts and wines and laundry. Edna had gone to East Hampton with the Riders. Bertie was away with Lance. Miss Dorothy could have the Brooklyn house to herself. This transplanting would make her work easier, but she realized that she would have to be notably charming in order to win his consent. She thought a good deal about what she should wear. She was engaged in this when Al came in. He was very hot and crumpled and cheerful. "Oh, Alfred," she cried. "André?" "Fine," he told her, "but I had a free afternoon. She had some friends there, and I thought I'd like to see you." "There's nothing at all wrong?" "Not a thing. Only, I don't know, I've been wanting to have a talk with you for a good while. I know I talk too much, but just the same, it seems to me the best way to get anywhere." "Sit down," she said, smiling. "I think you're very fortunate to be able to talk, Alfred. I can't think of anything nicer than to be able to express what you feel." He did sit down opposite her, and at once assumed his serious, conversational look. "It's a lot more than that," he said. "I have an idea that you can't really feel a thing until you do express it. That's the value of talking. Not that it conveys your ideas to someone else, because generally it doesn't, but that it wakes up your own brain. But this was going to be about André. There's something I want to get from you, something I can't get hold of." "If you mean how best to get on with her," she began, but he interrupted. "No, it's not that. That's all a mistake, this getting on with people. It means either humoring her like a spoiled child or trying to dominate her. Well, what I want is to let her alone, and that's what I can't do. I'm always trying to make her see things my way. But you can't help doing that when you know you're right. I don't know. I only think. I'm only an experimenter. I may be wrong about lots of things. Anyway, she's experimenting too, and she's altogether too fine to be bothered. I spent the best part of my life shouting people down, and now it's hard to stop. It isn't that I've tried to cram my ideas down anyone's throat, he assured her, earnestly. All I ever wanted to do was to start people thinking. I've always tried to keep hold of that idea that I was an experimenter, but I'm too darn sure. I'm not humble enough. Do you see? I interfere. Now that's what I've always admired so in you. That's what makes you so wonderful. You don't interfere. But, Alfred, said the frustrate ghost with something like a gasp, I wish you'd explain to me. Give me some idea how you do it. How your mind works, he went on. I mean, how can you watch, the way you do, without interfering? Many reasons prevented her from telling him that she had very often tried to interfere, and had invariably failed. She was silent for some time, while he waited anxiously for her words. I'd been thinking only last night that I didn't interfere nearly enough, she said at last. She raised her eyes to his face with a look he had never seen before, a glance troubled and appealing. She was making a heroic struggle for candor with her reticent and uncandid soul. No other living creature had seemed to her so human, so impersonal, so secure as this young man. She felt that she could say to him as much as her heart would ever permit her to utter. She quite forgot that he was waiting for wisdom from her. She grew pale with the intensity of her desire to hold communion with her kind, to hear the truth without entirely telling it. Alfred, she said, it seemed to me I'd wasted my life. But how? He demanded. By not helping. Well, he said honestly, of course there's a lot that needs doing in the world, and the people with money and leisure. I don't mean doing anything, she said with an impatient little frown. I mean influencing. I haven't tried to influence the people about me. He uttered a mild oath of himself. It was startling, to say the least, that she should talk like this, as if she hadn't heard a word he had spoken, when he had been waiting for the secret of her non-intervention. I should have tried to help my children, to influence them, she went on, with increasing agitation. I've stood aside. But don't you see, he cried, that's what's so wonderful. That's the fine thing about you. You've let them alone. Even if you haven't accomplished much yourself, you've given other people a chance. He was distressed to see tears in her eyes. My children aren't happy, she said. They're living, he said. They're growing. They're learning their own lessons in their own way. If you'd done what you call influence them, it would only mean that they saw things through your eyes. I've accomplished nothing. I've only passed through life like— His glance fell on the delft bowl. Like a flower, he said thoughtfully. You've just existed in a very sweet, gentle way. I think that's a mighty fine thing. I don't believe there are many people who've done so little harm. He got up. He took her outstretched hand and went off, without the sage advice he had come for, but consoled for lack of it by a variety of new ideas. And he left Claudine strangely assuaged. 4. She went walking along, gravely inspecting her sweet peas, bending over them to inhale their perfume, to touch with a delicate finger their exquisite petals. They had done very well. She was proud of them. People passing along the street stopped to look at them and their incredible variety, a great bloom of color against the high board fence. Faint pink, pale yellow, lavender, rose, a strange deep purple-brown. They looked like little winged things, alighting for the moment on the fragile vines. She came to the end of the row and turned the corner to the bed where the verbenas stood, and beside them a turbulent little sea of petunias, closely massed. The smell of the moist earth, of the grass freshly cut, of all the little flowers she had planted and tended, came to her on a tiny breeze, and a limitless joy filled her. Never before in her life she had felt so happy, so tranquil, so strong. Her glance embraced the smooth lawn stretching to the gravel drive that encircled the house, and the flower beds against the walls, filled with nasturtiums thickly bordered with sweet alyssum. Drenched in the sun, hot, fragrant, valiant little things. She was one with all of this, with no more purpose than they had. Alfred's words had filled her with actual bliss. She might be a ghost, but she was no more frustrate than that sweet pea that had swung loose from the string upon which it should have climbed, and swayed in the breeze, holding by nothing. She was an unlit lamp, but by the blaze of the sun, who needed her little flame? The world wanted nothing from her, and she had nothing to give. The turmoil of the night before was gone, her little effort ended. She saw Gilbert coming up the hill. He looked hot and cross, with his straw hat pushed back on his head, and the box of chocolates under his arm. But now his crossness didn't seem to her alien and alarming. He was nothing but Gilbert, a familiar mystery. There was no need to understand him, no need for any excessive interest in him. She wasn't required to explain herself to him, or him to herself. She believed that she could never again be repelled by any strangeness in him, or disturbed by what he did. Her soul felt relieved of all its burdens, light, almost gay. He was one person, and she was another. They couldn't gravely affect each other. They were not interdependent. They were allied, but it was an alliance only for their interest, not to hurt or to hamper them. She went out to meet him. With a friendly smile she led him up on the veranda and left him there, while she made an artful mint julep. Her friendliness didn't depend upon his being friendly. It was her own independent emotion, but it provoked an instant response from him. "What's come over you?" he asked curiously. "You haven't been like this for I don't know how long." "Perhaps it's this dear garden," she answered, vaguely. "You'd better stay in it, then," he said, with a sulky smile. "It agrees with you." "That's what I'd like to do. Won't you come down here for the rest of the summer, Gilbert? It's very cool and quiet." "I might," he answered, to her surprise. The sun had gone down, and a cheerful dusk had fallen, lively with the chirping of insects. They talked carelessly of the small things that interested them. He too grew affable, almost tranquil. Astonishing how little he wanted, not to be charmed, not to be comprehended, only to be accepted, casually and kindly, just as he was. An absurd idea came to her of their two souls, sitting side by side in rocking chairs, absorbed in the contemplation of life. She saw these souls as pliable white things, like half-melted candles with great black eyes. It made her laugh aloud. "What's the joke?" asked Gilbert. "Only the silliest sort of fancy," she said, in a comfortable tone that didn't irritate him. He didn't ask again, because he didn't care. His desire had always been to be understood, never to understand others, and any woman who could sit in the dusk by him while he smoked, who talked so little, who made a mint julep like that, undoubtedly understood him. He was content. End of section 28. End of The Unlit Lamp by Elisabeth Sanxay Holding.